Okay. So we're at the time there. Do we have any opening questions? I have one on the table, which will.
Well, I just hope that we will get into the end of alpha.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, we want to. I don't want to skip it.
Change.
Yeah, I want to do that. Yeah.
Oh, I thought we were way down in the.
Well, officially we're beyond that.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, but last time, as usual, we had some unfinished business, which we'll pick up. We'll pick up on that. Yeah.
And I'm wondering if at some point you could talk about the Descartes and the Psalms quotation at the beginning of Alpha.
At the beginning of Alpha. Okay.
All right, if we're going to do that, I want to stick in one thing also on quotations, because we've managed not to do the quotations. At the very beginning of the whole book, you have this nice quote from Corinthians, which you stick on a nice little piece of the thinking now occurring, retaining Corinthians. And I just thought...
Wait a minute, this is at the beginning of the book?
The very first thing in the book.
At the beginning of section A, the prolegomena?
Yes.
Yes.
For this world's understanding is being diverted to its own end.
Right.
It's not in Greek.
No, it's a translation.
Yeah, it's a translation. Right, okay.
I could say to you, it's a certain poetic license involved in that translation. Literally, it says. The schema of
Leahy. That formulation is a Leahy formulation.
Well, absolutely. I mean, in the first two lines translates the Greek, and then the next part is a bit of interpretation.
Right. Okay, but however, it's relevant. The literal Greek is very interesting that you bring it up, because it goes back to the question that Adam brought up last time about the schema, and which we wound up focusing on, which comes up again today. Yeah. The schema idea. Okay. Now the schema, although it's ironic, this is all ironic, right? In other words, the schema is not in my translation, but it's in the Greek.
Yes, that's right.
And so when Paul says the schema of this world is passing away, do you see? Mm-hmm. It turns out in the thinking now occurring that this is the time in history where you could say, in some literally philosophic sense, what Paul says happens, as it were, in essence, in the incarnation, now happens in the very form of thought, as it were. So yes, it's ironic that I don't translate the schema into English there, but I do in effect translate it into English in the actual analysis of the text. Okay, but now wait a minute. So we got diverted there from the original quotation, that's all right, which was the one at the beginning of Alpha, the one from Descartes in particular, and Descartes says on page 303 in the Principles of Philosophy. Now, is it the Descartes? What is the question precisely?
There is no precision to the question.
Okay.
Would you comment on why you use those quotes?
Oh, why the two quotes together?
Maybe this is an embarrassing question. I don't know.
Well, not for you, but for me, perhaps. Right.
Good, that's fine.
Finally, we shall not seek the reason for natural things from the end which God or nature has set before him in their creation, for we should not take so much upon ourselves as to believe that God would take us into his counsels. All right. So that's a statement on the surface of Descartes' modesty. Okay, and I'm putting it there because I want to contrast it with the stone. I want to contrast that passage with the stone rejected by the builders, proved to be the keystone. This is Yahweh's doing, and it is wonderful to see. This is the day made. So what I'm saying implicitly by that juxtaposition of those particular two quotes is that in being so modest, Descartes is rejecting what turns out to be the keystone. By setting aside, by rejecting the notion that God would take us into his counsels, that apparent modesty, you see, is a rejection of, we're not called to be modest, you see? And we ought to take the bull by the horn, so to speak. That's the idea.
That quote is often translated as, it's become the cornerstone.
Yes.
Is this your translation?
No, I don't think so. I can't remember whether this is my translation. I probably not. Wherever I don't have to translate, I don't. So I probably took this from someplace. And keystone, cornerstone, capstone. it's somewhat ambiguous, I think, in the Hebrew.
Okay, because
Yeah.
their significance is quite different.
Yes.
In terms of construction.
Yeah. Now, but whether or not it's, I'd have to go back and look at the Hebrew to say who's translating it correctly. But the idea is that it's the stone without which everything is going to fall down. It's the stone that provides the basis for your structure, whether it's the keystone, the capstone, or the foundation stone, or the cornerstone. It's the idea. It's the essential stone.
They're
without
essential, but in quite different ways. The
Okay.
cornerstone is part of the foundation. The keystone is what makes the thing work.
Yeah. All right.
So
Okay.
it probably is Keystone. Sounds like the right translation.
Well,
I have no idea.
we'll put it on the agenda.
Yeah.
Between now and next week, we'll find out.
Okay.
I'll put it on the forum. Okay. Any other questions for openers, based on the assignment or otherwise? Yeah.
That's an embarrassing question. After all these sessions that we have had, could you say in as few words as possible how the distinction between transcendental and transcendent?
It's on page 259.
Because you stumbled over it?
Well, because I worried about it for 2 years.
59.
And when I finally saw it, I said, ah!
Where on 259?
Well, when he's talking about Husserl, which is may not be
Right. Well,
exactly
it's the-
how you use it, but that's where
Yes.
the
Right.
distinction is first made, so far as I know.
Yeah, or at least
In
it's
the
made
book.
explicitly there, I think.
Yeah.
Right. In fact,
That's what I meant
I think you're
explicitly.
referring to. It's actually a quotation from Husserl on page 259, and
Are you saying it like that?
yeah.
It's shift.
It does shift a little bit,
Yeah.
but it doesn't shift altogether.
Okay.
But yes, so I think in terms of this question, yeah,
Yeah.
this is as good an opening answer to your question as on page 259 at the bottom. Husserl is speaking, and he says, "The world, whose conceivable non-being does not extinguish my pure being, but rather presupposes it, is termed transcendent, whereas my pure being or my pure ego is termed transcendental." All right. So I did touch on this sometime earlier in the course. This question came up one way or the other, and the confusion in our use of the term transcendent is that we often, historically and perhaps personally, think of transcendence as something altogether out of reach. Yeah, beyond our comprehension or whatever. And Husserl's phenomenological use of transcendence is it's not so much that it's out of reach or invisible and so forth, but it's distinguished from, it's in some sense distance from, if not literal distance, I mean a kind of ontological difference from the ego, right, which is beholding it, right? So it's the object is transcendent to the subject. Here is the sense in which he's using it, and for the most part, I'm probably always using it with that in mind. Although Chuck is right, as the thinking becomes more itself, as the thinking now is occurring, there's a kind of a shift, but not. I wouldn't say a shift that violates this, but it maybe subtletizes it or something.
Well, certainly the transcendental essence of existence
Right.
is not necessarily in transcendental ego.
Oh yes, that's right,
Yeah.
that's right, yes, and okay, that's fair. But just in terms of the basic meanings of the terms, right? So the transcendental essence of existence itself is transcendent. That's going back to what does thinking God mean, right? It looks like the world, but get rid of the looks like. It is the world, you see? And if the world, and so this is the connection with Husserl, if the world is the transcendent, which is exactly what he says here, you see, then yes, the transcendental essence of existence itself is not the pure transcendental subjectivity of Husserl, right? But, right, which is not now, in the thinking now occurring, is not, that is, the transcendental essence of existence itself is not, how can I put it? It's not transcendent to the world, but it is the transcendence of the world in the phenomenological sense of it is the world. Right? The world is it. Now that changes the structure, to put it mildly, radically changes the structure of what it is that is being beheld, right? Of what is being seen.
What had been the transcendence of the world
Right.
now bears the transcendental essence of the world, but actually is neither. The contrast is no longer in operation.
Yes, right. Yeah, that's right. There's an identity.
Because
right.
the world is no longer transcendent in the sense as being something over against its appearance. And the way in which it's transcendental is no longer something that's remote.
Right. Okay.
Does
But-
that
so how-
distinction carry through with the adverb form? Because you talked about transcendently and transcendentally. I think it's an alpha, but it
Yeah.
occurred several times. and I was
Well,
trying to
I would say
understand.
yes. I would say yes. Basically, the
Yes,
answer is
but-
yes. Well, but we'd have to have the particular context to elaborate on it. Yeah, but
It
as
occurred
a matter,
several times.
Yeah. Okay. Were you about to say something?
I was, but I'm going to wait.
Okay. Any other?
Well, on that subject, what about page 345? About 2/3 of the way down. This is the transcendent identity of an essentially transcendental thinking, in which transcendence itself is essentially transcendent.
Right. Thought's new object. Okay. Well, I definitely want to do that sentence, but I don't know whether I want to start with that sentence.
Yeah.
Okay, so you won't let me skip it when we get into that chapter, but I just want to get back to alpha so that we can. All right, so we'll note that. Any other observations, questions?
One question I had was
Okay.
On page 334. You don't have to answer it right now. Maybe we'll get
Okay.
to it. But you ask, what in essence is the essence of history?
Whereabouts are we now? On 334, I see it.
Right there.
About a little below the middle of the page, right?
Right. It is being itself at the disposal of thought itself.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just curious to get an elaboration
Okay.
of that. I mean, I got the. Well, I'll stop there.
Okay. Okay. Now that's still today's assignment, and that's good. Okay. Any other openers?
Well,
Question?
on that
All right.
same page, the
Should really make a
little
note of
bit-
these
little bit
pages.
further down,
Right.
it is the essential repetition of the essence of history and thought itself. Now, is that repetition a one-time event or an ongoing event?
Well, the essential repetition.
Don't tell me it's both, please.
I want to tell you it's both, in the sense
No,
that
no,
it's a one-time event. It's a first-time event, but it's not. But the essence of what is occurring is that it is essentially occurring. It is so.
So it's occurring through a series of nows, loosely speaking.
Yeah, it's occurring in a now that is absolute in the sense that it is a now essentially non-comparative. So it's a kind of perfect or absolute dynamism. And it goes back to the image of the stream that you brought up, and we elaborated a little bit on the forum. The flow is, there's nothing but flow, and if you're looking for something to hang on to, you're going to drown. So it's a sink or swim without relief. Now that's not, I'll grant you,
No timeout.
with no timeout, that is not, I don't know what, it's not encouraging if you're looking for rest or if you're looking for an escape. Yeah. So there's a kind of absoluteness
Totally
to.
undefinable, too.
Well, I would say, depending on what we mean by undefinable, I think it may be undefinable, but it's not unthinkable. I mean, I think that's what, in fact, I would
It's
say.
only thinkable by saying we reject all definitions. Or we transcend all definitions.
We insist upon thinking any definition through
To its
to
what? Transcendence?
to its termination in existence.
Termination.
Right.
Kaput.
No, but that goes back to your first question.
Excellent.
Its termination in existence is not kaput. Its termination in existence is in some sense,
Is voila.
the ongoing reality.
But the ongoing reality is undefinable because it's the stream that.
Well, now we're going around it.
Well, of course we are. Well, that's what this.
No,
book is.
because I say it's not undefinable. It is definable as thinkable, or it's defined if we're thinking through to its termination in existence. It's not, in any unqualified sense, undefinable. Okay. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Let's just try and do some of the things we should do before we get ourselves altogether out of alpha. And maybe just to pick up something of the context here, beginning. Let's say beginning at the top of page 323 at the end of the second line. Now, thought comprehends in its object the transcendent difference of past thought, now in fact transformed its own identity. In its object, thought now comprehends the historical essence in motion. And in a certain sense, this sentence is, if it's not an answer to Jim's objection or question, it's certainly relevant, and maybe in some sense it is an answer. The essence of history transforming the dual matters of essentially recollective thinking into the Novitas Mundi, now occurring in the Novitas Mentis for the first time, as the intelligibility of the fact in essence, the synthesis of the fact itself. And I think the question that I'm hearing you ask, or the objection I'm hearing in the question, probably has something to do with the fact that, you'll pardon the expression, we think of a fact as, and you get this in Peirce. Peirce is very good on this. Peirce's firstness, secondness, and thirdness. Firstness is spontaneity. Secondness is brute reality, or if you abstract it from the other two moments, it's sheer regularity. Well, sheer regularity is immovable, right? And so that for Peirce is the level of fact. The level of secondness is factuality. It's whether you like it or not kind of thing, right? In other words, it's a fact. Your mother must have told you, well, face up to it. It's a fact. Get with it, So the fact is that which is just the way it is, and there's nothing you can do about it, and it doesn't need to be explained because it's brutally there, right? Okay. That's our traditional understanding of the fact. So what the bold claim, if you want, of the thinking now occurring is that the fact is synthesized, right? That the fact is, in that sense, not simply unaccounted for, right? The fact itself is in some way intelligible in the thinking now occurring, right? So in that sense, I've been thinking about this because as we all are, I'm doing more than one thing, and so I'm thinking about something else too, but it's all ties in. And I was thinking about Peirce in this, in relation to the thinking now occurring, even though he doesn't come up in this text. And Peirce has a lot of very interesting ideas. And one of them is that one of his principal starting places is that there is no such thing as an absolutely incognizable reality. Okay? And I was thinking of literally the proximity of that notion, which is that foundational in American pragmatism, the proximity, but only the proximity of it to the thinking now occurring. In other words, where Peirce says as a leading principle that there is no absolutely inexplicable reality, the thinking now occurring says, well, you're on the right track, as it were, right? But there's no completely inexplicable reality. There is no inexplicable reality, as it were, in principle. That's what the thinking now occurring is saying. So in that sense, and by the way, I have to, just to back up a little bit to show you the subtleties of Peirce's thought, I abstracted his secondness, you see. But the whole point in Peirce is that the level of factuality, the level of secondness, is never actually, it's a kind of Hegelian insight, it's never actually existing in abstraction from spontaneity and from the habit-taking tendency, right? So Peirce is very much aware that secondness, the level of law and regularity, and this is why he anticipates Heisenberg and quantum mechanics. He understands that since we never find secondness, which would be pure factuality, pure immovability, or pure, absolute, as it were, regularity. We never actually find it apart from firstness. It presupposes firstness. You can't have a second without a first. Okay? I mean, just logically, and he understands the connection there. So ontologically, there is no regularity that completely has exhausted all spontaneity. And therefore, Peirce says, I was rereading this today, we think that there are laws of nature and that they don't change, but really, why shouldn't they change every once in a while a little bit? Why shouldn't there be imperceptible change in the laws, in what is otherwise the regularity of the world? You see, why shouldn't there be a little bit, I don't think he used the term, but in effect, why shouldn't there be a little bit of chaos in the laws themselves? You see, not something that escapes the laws, but there is no law, there is no lawfulness, there is no regularity, there is no factuality, you see, which is completely impenetrable, and therefore on another level of discussion, there is no, because ultimately reality is like factuality in Peirce. I don't say they're absolutely synonymous, but it's that kind of thing. In other words, the reality is the ultimately unmovable, unchangeable whatever, which, since, as I've just said, we have yet to, and in some sense never will, actually exhaust spontaneity. Reality is always in the sense of becoming more and more real, more and more the fact, simply the fact, more and more, you see, regular. So the whole thrust of the world, this will help me come back to thinking now occurring, believe it or not. The whole thrust of the whole movement in Peirce is from the beginning to the end, right? Now the goalposts, the beginning and the end goalposts, which in Peirce are absolutes, right? The key fundamental notion of American pragmatism is that I don't know what the image would be. Like the route from the beginning to the end, it's as if you could just keep extending it. That is, we never actually arrive at the end. However, there is a tendency of the world to become more and more real. See, this came up somewhere on television. It keeps coming up. The American dream. See, well, what is the American dream? And people have all kinds of ways of. Oh, I know. I was listening to commencement speeches on C-SPAN about 3 a.m, and somebody, one of them gave a talk on the American dream. And I was interested in that. I forget which one it was. Doesn't make too much difference. But the American dream is not up for grabs idea. In other words, if you look at it philosophically, it's quite well defined. And the American dream is reality. In other words, the American notion is, and you see this in Peirce, that reality itself is the realization of what, relatively speaking, is an original dream-like state. Do you see? So the world is more and more fluid the further back you go. And by the way, not only the quantum guys, but the cosmologists finally caught up with this idea. Do you see? And the person doing all this just while he's, sitting in the government office there back in the 19th century. The world originally is kind of a fluid, amorphous state, and there's a habit-taking tendency which takes the firsts that appear in this not pure nothingness, you see, in this nothingness, nothing in particular, and over time, right, the world becomes more and more regular, more and more discrete. The galaxies form. He doesn't use this metaphor, but this is the physics, the cosmological physics metaphor. The galaxies form, and then eventually planets, and then life, and here we are, right? Okay. And the universe is becoming more and more regular. Now, the key thing in Peirce is that at that end goalpost, that absolute, you'll pardon the expression, termination, right, of the process, at the absolute termination of the process, by definition, there will be no more spontaneity. In other words, what you will have ultimately is unqualified reality. Right now, where things are becoming more and more real, and the ultimate ideal goal, ideal in the sense that we will never actually arrive there, but if, as it were, we did arrive there, the world would be totally immobile in the sense that it would be fully realized, fully specified, fully, completely, unalterably determined. Do you see? Okay. Now, the key thing for Peirce is that we never arrive there because the ideal in American thought, as I was saying one time over against Hegel, is it's the ideal of the ideal, right? In other words, the ideal is always improvable. There's never a time when it can't be there isn't something more to be done, okay? And so it's in the long run, which we never actually arrive at, right? Now, the reason I think that's, okay, so go back to the factuality. So I went on Peirce's behalf, having abstracted his secondness out a moment, even Peirce understands, in other words, that there is no actual simply brute reality, right? That the laws of nature are not perfectly complete in and of themselves or in their operation, right? But ideally, they would be in the course of time, at the end of time, so to speak. The thinking now occurring. Now, here you have to. This is the dangerous juncture. When you make the analogy, you have to understand as soon as you take the analogy seriously, you've jumped. You're no longer an American pragmatist, and it's a whole new ballgame, and it doesn't quite mean exactly the same thing, right? But what I'm saying in response to Jim's question is that, or in the text here on this page, as far as it relates to Jim's question in my mind, is that in the thinking now occurring, the fact itself is synthesized, all right? It is not simply, not absolutely unintelligible. It is not in any way unintelligible, or putting it more positively, it is completely intelligible. But once I do that, I've gone beyond Peirce, or we have gone beyond Peirce, to be actually more accurate, all right? We have gone beyond Peirce, and we are saying, as I say in my response to Chuck, and I said it once before in class, in some sense, which we need to think about, we need to think, we have arrived. It's as if, okay? As if, and I think somewhere in the text I speak about the world having ended in essence, the end of the world in essence. You see? It's as if the universe has terminated. You see? Now,
but there's a new universe.
Well, that's it. Yeah, I mean that is.
What was wrong with the old one?
It just kept postponing the dream, the realization.
Why do we need a universe?
We don't. It's a gift. It's a gift. We don't need it. It's just there to be enjoyed. Okay.
But there is a new universe. That's comforting.
Right. Okay. In the context of this thinking, that let's stay off the new part about it. Let's get back to the termination part. The thinking thinks the object as terminating in existence, so that I want to say something like quite the contrary to what Peirce imagines as the ideal end point where all firstness would have been exhausted, all, as it were, all the potentiality, you say, all the spontaneity would have been taken out of things. If the universe now reaches its termination in thought, here and now, not postponing that end point, you see, in any sense of the word, then the what do I want to say? The incompatibility, okay, of specification and spontaneity is eliminated, or that logic underlying that has been gotten beyond. I'll try another one here. I mentioned Boole, I think it was last time, and that Boole couldn't add 1 and 0 logically. Peirce explains because he didn't have a logical addition, a logical operation of addition, which doesn't tell you much, but that's Peirce's explanation. Peirce has a logical operation of addition, so he adds 1 and 0, and he gets 1. Right? And I was pointing out that in the logic of the thinking now occurring as laid out in the foundation, you can add 1 and 0. You can add 1 and 0, but instead of getting 1, as Peirce does, and as you do in first grade, you get una. All right. So that the 0 there, I said, was whatever it was, it certainly wasn't simply nothing. All right. So just using that little analysis as a framework here, I don't think I said this last time, but it might be worth saying. The thinking now occurring overcomes, sets aside, is beyond, transcends, however you want to put it, the last remaining and somewhat disguised forms even of dualism, right? Whatever kind of. So you could say that Boole, who can't get everything and nothing together, you can't even imagine getting them together, period, doing the operation, well, he's more dualistic than Peirce, who can relate the two things, being and nothing, right? In fact, right. So in that sense, there is a kind of respect for the triad in Peirce, you see, which are not right. He's less of a dualist, right? But what I'm saying is, that from the perspective, as it were, of the thinking now occurring, he remains. In fact, I do this explicitly in Foundation. The triad in Peirce, and in this sense, he does not get beyond Hegel. He gets beyond Hegel in many important specific ways, but you could say fundamentally both the Hegelian and the Peircean triad or trinity or threeness, right, remains fundamentally participating in some kind of irreducible duality. So to go back to my little example, what the logic of the thinking now occurring takes from Boole, okay, Boole, who cannot add 1 and 0, what the thinking now occurring takes from the logic of absolutes, Boole's logic, right, is reflected in the fact that when in the real trinary thinking, as I come to call it, in real trinary thinking, when you add 1 and 0, right, you get unum, you get something, you might say, unexpected. That reflects something of the Boolean impossibility of adding 1 and 0, which for Peirce is not a problem. He can add 1 and 0, and he gets 1, right? You see what I'm saying? So in the thinking now occurring, you have, as it were, from Peirce, the ability to add 1 and 0, but that the result is unum, that it's completely, I want to say, I think this fits. It's completely unexpected. I mean, now I expect it. I'm used to it, right? But originally, I would not expect an unum to pop up. When I would expect, you see, I would expect 1. So that surprise, do you see? All right. So that novelty is a kind of negative agreement with Boole. Right. You see what I'm saying? Yeah.
Did you say last class what unum is? Or can you say anything about it?
Well, I did say, I didn't focus on it, but I did say in effect that it is. Is that okay? The window okay? It is. I can't go into it in great depth because it's just too much. But it's like an absolute middle between being and nothing, and the notion of an absolute middle would be consistent with what I'm trying to get here at in a different way. Is that it excludes the alternative end posts in the sense that it excludes them, it includes them. Right? That is, it excludes their exclusion. You see what I'm saying? In other words, it excludes the notion that the beginning and the end remain, certainly in pragmatism, infinitesimally out of reach. You see? So the unum in some sense incorporates into itself the otherwise impossible end post, the otherwise fundamental dualism of even the Trinitarianism of pragmatism, which has such great respect for the middle, for the third. But that third is what? It's just a way of avoiding ever coming either to that absolute beginning or to that absolute end. So here is unum is like an absolute middle, which is not averse to containing within itself absolutely the beginning and the end, which now brings, I can close the circle of what I was trying to do, so that in the synthesis of the fact, in the thinking now occurring, I have the synthesis of the fact terminating in existence itself, terminating in a kind of perpetual surprise, right, a perpetual spontaneity, but terminating, ending in spontaneity, you see, and doing so through the synthesis of thought, right? The fact is synthesized, created, actively contemplated by the thinking now occurring, you see. And so, in effect, as I was saying in a different context, those Trinitarian persons of Augustine, you see, without being any less separate and distinct from one another in some important sense, nevertheless are the one God, right? So the unum is a kind of essential way of representing in a logical system. Although I wasn't thinking this is the point I was making. One of the points I was making last week. I wasn't thinking this when I was doing it. I wasn't thinking in these Trinitarian terms. But nevertheless, now that we look at it, it's in effect a kind of, if you want, a single embodiment of the notion of the intelligibility in the context of the thinking now occurring of the Trinitarian notion. There it is. Okay.
Did the thinking now occurring choose the term unum because it's a peculiarly American thinking?
No, it's a good question. I didn't. There was no conscious. Although later on in Foundation, I do. Interesting enough, when I'm doing Peirce, but I'm widening out Peirce's, my analysis of Peirce as kind of prototypically the American consciousness. I do refer, and I think this is before I actually got to actually specifying the logic. I think I did this, if my memory serves me correctly, I think, before I got to the unum in this technical sense. I did refer to the unum, e pluribus unum, the American ideal as we find it on our dollar bills, right, in the Great Seal of the United States. But I didn't know, there was no conscious connection there, and whether or not it should be probed, no, maybe. It's interesting.
Just I've been meaning to say this.
Okay.
But as a lawyer,
Right.
I can tell you that American law in particular has this embrace of chaos in it.
Mm-hmm.
And even though that's not original to it in the sense that it was nascent in the English common law, certainly American jurisprudence regards law as a dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay.
To that extent, not that it's particularly relevant.
Well, I think it is
And
relevant.
I don't know when the laws. I don't know when the laws of nature were first framed as such. Who was the first to use the law?
Oh, you mean the notion of
the notion of laws of nature?
I don't know. I think it's probably a medieval. That would be my answer offhand. The laws of nature, in the sense in which we use the term, I think is a medieval context. It's implicit. It's latent in ancient thought, I think, but I don't think, in the sense in which we use it, I think it's a pre-modern medieval concept, the natural law.
Oliver Wendell
Anybody?
Holmes has been associated with those some thought.
All right.
Junior? Other one, Junior?
I don't know the one who was Supreme Court
Junior.
junior.
His father was a poet.
Okay, I thought you were going to ask me when the natural laws begin, and in Peirce you said they evolve. But that's what you were asking me a different question. But that's what I was thinking.
I think it is interesting that here we are in this country, and this thinking has occurred in this country.
Yes. Oh, I think it's more than interesting. You asked me a more specific question about the term unum.
Maybe necessary.
No, I don't know that it's necessary, but it's fitting. It's suitable. It would be a themistic answer. It's not necessary, but it's suitable. It's appropriate. Perhaps, right? But the trick here, the thing you have to be so careful of, is that this thinking, in principle, transcends American thought, right? Which I've, in a certain technical way, I've just tried to acknowledge, right? Yeah. Okay. Well, I know. Well, yeah, I guess. Let's come back to the text. The essence of history, about 5 lines down on page 323, transforming the dual methods of essentially recollective thinking into the now occurring for the first time as the intelligibility of the fact in essence, the synthesis of the fact itself. In this pure act, thought itself surmounts the barriers. Now, I didn't mean this in Peirce's terms, but it
Is this
fits.
page 323?
Yeah, 323
That's why
about.
congratulate. There's actually a paragraph break on this page.
Yes. It rises above the rule. It sings of the glory of creation itself. Conscious now for the first time of the essential difference between permanence and identity, it sees that change itself is the essence of transcendence, not continuous but essential change. And I think that does address the difficulty that you're pointing to, or the objection. It may not be a satisfying address to that difficulty, but that is it, right? In other words, what we have to get beyond is thinking of change as continuous. So there's a kind of radical discontinuity. That comes up again in today's assignment, so I'm going to save it till we get to today's assignment. Okay. Now, let's see. At the bottom of page 323, now for the first time in history, the appearance of the transcendental essence of existence itself is understood to be the transcendent essence of the conversion of thought itself from being something essentially conceived to exist as an absolute form, skipping the parenthesis, to being essentially existence itself in the form of thought, identifying itself wholly with its object. And this is another way of saying what I was trying to say last time. If you could imagine, you know what I'm reminded of, and I know nothing about this, right? So I need a photographer to tell me what this. But no, yeah, I think I'm stupid enough to know what this means. You know those old box cameras where the guy put the hood over his head, right? And he put the plate in the back, right? And then you pose, and he had the thing up here, and then what did he do to take the picture? Didn't he pull something out? Didn't he remove something?
He moves the plate in front of the plate.
Excellent. Okay, excellent. It's excellent. I mean, it's just a metaphor, but it's a good metaphor. You see, removing the schema, getting the plate out, right, and now the picture's being taken. There it is. There's your picture, right then and there, just like that. Right.
That's still a camera, though.
It's a metaphor. Right. You're right. Well, yeah, right. Okay. Well, okay. I'll play the game if you insist. Thought is the camera that now sees without any obstruction what it's there to take the picture of, what it's there to see. Now, of course, the thing breaks down more because the camera is alive, and it's not even a motion picture is too weak an analogy here, right? But that's the idea. Okay. Okay. So the whole identity, the wholeness of the identification of thought and its object would be the idea, without this intermediate schema of whatever form. This thinking essentially conceives its object's existence as wholly unconditioned, its appearance itself. Now that's going to come up. That whole issue of appearance itself is central to the first 5 pages of Gamma, which is on the agenda today, so we'll hold that too. Okay, in this conversion of thought itself to being formally transcendent now for the first time, the universe is transformed essentially from being something new to being what is now new, its appearance itself. Or another way of putting that, just to speak a little more loosely, what is new now? In the now, it's new, right? It's not, the novelty of the object is, again, not comparative. Its newness is essential and integral to the now of thought is the idea. All right. And then getting closer to the notations on the next page.
So, can I just
Yeah,
say,
sure.
So, you mean in a sense it's neither new nor old. It's neither. Namely, the word new is new.
Yes,
It's not
yes.
old word new.
Yes, that's true. I think that's, and that would be true of a lot of the problem of
Yes.
of restating,
Yes.
of trying to say the thinking.
Yeah.
Right, because we inevitably have to use words that are probably being used because the context, not just the context of the book, but the context of reality has changed, and therefore these words, yes, need to be thought through.
But still, its newness is on the side of newness, not on the side of the neitherness.
Just as
Yeah.
now is on the side of nowness and out on the side of
Then-ness.
then of her.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I mean,
right.
there are people who are thinking in terms of neither new nor old that very much are not
Yes.
where you are.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
And that reminds me, Nancy was good enough to give me a book recently. I don't know whether any of you people are familiar with it, by Bernadette Roberts, called The Experience of No Self. And I read it with great care because I was hoping that I could retire. Unfortunately, I was not surprised to find that I can't, because to give you an example, she says that when you get rid of the self, you get rid of the other, because you can't have another without a self. You see? It's like saying you can't have a now without a then, or you can't have a new without an old. You see? And so, although she goes a great way, she remains, in my book, a contemporary mystic. Right? She has a son. This is all secondhand to most of you, I guess, but she says in the book, it's very human. It's a good book. It's well worth reading. But if you're looking for what's absolutely and essentially new, I don't think you're going to find it in that book. But she has a son. Her oldest son, she said, raised the objection one day. How the heck did he phrase it? But anyway, whatever she was saying about the no self and so forth and so on, it really bothered him, because it was something to the effect, I can't quote it now, but it was to the effect that, well, it takes away all of the unique. That was it. This was his objection, right? It seemed to him that if he were to follow her into the unknown, you see, that's another difference. Unknown, unknowable in some sense. He was objecting to his mother that this would erase all the uniqueness of individual people. Right? And I'm very empathetic with that objection. So I'm right on, right? Good objection, right? Her answer was, no. There'll always be. And then, because you don't need to be, her precise answer is, well, you don't need to be self-conscious. We don't need self-consciousness to have the differentiation in the world, right? And so she points to the trees and the plants, and they're all very unique, but we don't ascribe to them any kind of self-consciousness, and yet they have a right. But the key thing is that she says. Now, I'm saying the reason I'm telling you all of this is because it's by way of counter illustration of what the thinking now occurring wants to think. So she's reassuring her son, in effect, in the book, that the elimination of self-consciousness is not the elimination of differentiation, but then she describes this differentiation. This is where dualism keeps coming back out from under the woodwork, as a fact of the empirical world. Do you see? So there's a contrast there. She doesn't use the word theoretical, right? But between the realm at which she has arrived and the empirical world, she makes an important distinction. And this is not just an accident of language, because later on she has the goodness to quote, by hearsay, a passage from Thomas Aquinas. It's really nice, just a line. And Thomas has a work called De Potentia, right, concerning potentiality or whatever. And she quotes the line. She says, she doesn't say she looked it up, right? She says, this could be a misquote, but anyway, it interests her, because if Thomas said what somebody told her he said, she wants to distance herself from it. And what the line says is that that creatures are in the essence of God. So I went back dutifully and looked up the original to make sure, whether she got it right. And basically, right. But what the line doesn't say is what the full context in which Thomas is speaking, right? Creatures are in the essence of God, says Thomas in De Potentia, in two ways. He doesn't say in two ways, but they are in two ways. He says what the two ways are. As cognizables, as known, as objects of cognition, right? As known things. And they are there in the essence of God as products, as that which the essence of God produces, right? So as known and as made to be, in effect, if we could translate it, right? Now, here's the reason I'm doing all of this is that, all right, so having quoted the line without quoting the full context, but looking at the context, okay, fine, good. because she then goes on to say, Bernadette Roberts, that for her, in the essence of the divine, where in some sense, now I have to be careful here because she's also in a certain sense, her hero, the very telling hero, whom we've mentioned in here for Bernadette, turns out to be Eckhart, Meister Eckhart. And Eckhart was the 14th century Dominican, ironic, right? Ironic. She takes advantage of the irony to say that, well, what Thomas did theologically is one half of the whole pie, but you need Eckhart in order to get the full picture. And what Eckhart does, of course, is he becomes a heretic. That is, he goes beyond the Trinity, right? He goes to the oneness of God at, as it were, the expense of the Trinity. Now, of course, as she points out, and which is historically the case, Eckhart never thought that he was a heretic. He thought there was something wrong with the inquisitors. They were not too learned or something they didn't appreciate. But nevertheless, she is Eckhartian because what she says is, unlike Thomas, but like Eckhart, in whatever you want to call this unknown, this God beyond God, as I think Eckhart would call it, all right? For her, for Bernadette, there are no creatures and there is no we. So the reason to close that circle. So if there's any doubt about how she's using the word, in other words, she's giving her son, I would say, small comfort. Right? In other words, she's satisfying his need for the uniqueness of individual people on an empirical basis. That world that I'm pointing at and thinking now occurring, that otherwise would be called the empirical world in a self-conscious realm, you see. That's the realm in which we continue to have a significant difference called individual people, the collective of which would be we, right? But the ultimate to which Bernadette has arrived, whatever, if you want to call that the divine, then there are no creatures there, and there is no we in that realm, you see. So there's a dissolution, an ultimate dissolution, you see, of the otherwise fully acknowledged differentiation of our experience. It's ultimately dissolved in the mystical approach. So as Chuck pointed out, the thinking now occurring in a certain sense is the absolute bracketing, the absolute putting out of play, absolutely as it were, of the mystical, which leaves us back with what otherwise would be an you see, but here's what, again, I don't want to say renovation of language because you have to renovate that word, right? The novation of language requires us to say what otherwise would be understood as the empirical world is the only world. It's right? And therefore, that we don't need the reservation empirical, you see, and we don't need to put any reservations upon the ultimate dissolution of the absolute differentiation which otherwise is acknowledged even in that mystical enterprise. Okay, yes.
Just to go back to something you said last time.
Okay.
I'm apropos of Chuck saying, but when I said it's neither new nor old, and Chuck said, but the word is on the side of.
Yeah. Right.
And last time you said something about, but we're not there yet.
Right.
And if we were, then we wouldn't even have the word new or the word now.
Well,
that
we wouldn't.
transcends old and new.
I would say that if we were, this is a problem. This is a problem. I think I don't know whether it's a problem in the text. It's as if the text has a problem. You know what I mean? I mean, it has problems, but I don't know that that's a problem. But this yetness,
yes.
the fact that there's some kind of not yetness, even though this absolutely otherwise unqualified claim, as it were, is being made,
yes.
that there is no difference in the identity of the object and the thinking beholding it, right? That there's only one identity there, and the identity of the thought is, as it were, coming from its object, as if the thought, if I could take it apart from that object, would have no, and I think I said that somewhere in today's assignment, has taken by itself, it has no identity, and then I could say a little bit redundantly, and a fortiori, no identity of its own, to say. So the identity of thought is the other, or the otherness of the object, which go back to my comments on Bernadette, is that this thing he says, there is a otherness, which is, and this goes back to, again, another way of coming around, so there is a new without an old, right? And in that sense, it's more on the side of the new than, right? And there is a other without a self, okay? And so now again, just to jump ahead to foundation, I actually, after I started to do the logical digit stuff, I got, I started counting digits. Well, then you're back into arithmetic, and when you're arithmetic, you're not so far from geometry. So one serious image in the thinking now occurring in foundation is this absolute dead center cube, which I define and give some visual indication of in the text, is absolutely. Chuck is laughing. Chuck is chuckling at that notion, right?
I noticed at the sum. Some indication.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
right. Well, I don't want to make claims that I can't back up.
That's you
Absolutely one-sided, right? And it goes a little bit. There's some justification in this notion of the four-dimensionality of a cube. Absolutely one-sided. But that fits logically. I mean, conceptually, Chuck's comment about more on the side of, I don't think he intended quite this, but I'm going to take it all the way. The new is more on the side of the new. It's completely on the side of the new.
It's like these Hollywood sets that have no rear.
Okay, all right. As it were. Right.
Perfectly flat.
Yes, absolutely flat, and goes back. This is the same theme as Adam put on the table. I don't know whether it was deliberately or not, but it was right on when I was trying to explain how it's not turtles all the way down, but it's new all the way down, and your comment was then there's no depth, right? So it's a kind of an absolute surface, absolute superficiality. Okay, which will ironically may tie in right now if we can get to it. Okay. All right. So let's just read quickly through that middle of that page 324, so we can get to the energy thing. The universe is, in essence, its very appearance. Let's skip the parenthesis. Furthermore, the acquisition of energy by past thought in the form of its universe of things. This acquisition, jumping through to the little below the middle of the page, this acquisition is now seen in accord with the irreversible historical function of modern thought as the preparation absolutely of what occurs not before now, to be transformed into thought's identity with energy itself. Now, before, again, I want to slow down a little bit before we focus on the energy issue. Notice, in accord with the irreversible historical function of modern thought. So I think this ties in with this language question and the more on the side of the new, right? And I'm saying, well, like completely on the side of the new, like there is no, because what? Because we have we've crossed a threshold from which there is no going back. There is no rear, to retreat to, so to speak. I mean, we have, it's as if, all right? I don't think it has the same meaning exactly as you find it in Kierkegaard or in Heidegger, but as if the leap is no longer a question because everything is up. Everything is in the middle of nowhere, as it were, right? Everything has leapt, right? And that's the great thing. When Kierkegaard is talking about the sin of the learner in Philosophical Fragments, that necessitates the God showing up to provide the learner with the knowledge that he is in a state of sin, which he otherwise wouldn't know. How would he know that? Who, apart from revelation, and maybe apart from the Christian revelation, who thinks of themselves as radically a sinner? It's not a very natural way to put it. I mean, I don't think Aristotle thought that way, or Plato. Okay. So the natural human being does not think, right? So we need the God to show up, says Kierkegaard. Now, it's not just to inform, to enlighten, to teach in a very extraordinary way the learner the truth about himself, that he is, Kierkegaard doesn't say this, but in effect he does, the embodiment of untruth. That's what he's saying, right? To exist, Kierkegaard is, there's a problem, right? For Kierkegaard, to exist is sin, right? I mean, that's a really dark thought, okay?
The crime of birth and death.
Yeah. All right. But the God doesn't have to show up just to enlighten, to inform, to teach in that sense, but he also has to provide the learner with with salvation. He has to say to the learner, the key thing here, which I thought of, and this is just by way of analogy, maybe it isn't, I don't know, maybe it's very deep, I haven't thought about it, but you can think about it, is that the learner can't save himself. And the reason, now here's the reason why he can't save himself, is that he got into this predicament freely. Okay? In other words, he was truly free. Now I'll use Kierkegaard doesn't use this analogy, but I think it's right on to what he's talking about. You are free to jump off the Brooklyn Bridge. You are absolutely free to do so. You are not free, having jumped off the Brooklyn Bridge halfway down, to change your mind. You're not. If you really are free to do something, you see, you can't have a safety. You can't have something in reserve, right? Otherwise, you really haven't done it, right? You're playing. You're running down and dipping your feet in the water, right? But you haven't entered the water. You see, you've got something in reserve. You've got it behind. Right? You're covered, and in fact, we say that you're covering your behind. You're covering your rear end. Do you see? Okay. So freedom in this sense, right? It's not exactly something we're too keen on having. I mean, that's Kierkegaard's point. See, the natural man doesn't want to be this free. I don't want to be free that I really can affect something on the condition that what I do is irreversible. You know, Kierkegaard would say, for all eternity. Right? And then, of course, he puts a positive spin on that because he wants to have a few readers, only one or two here and there. In time, I can achieve my eternal blessedness. The flip side, which is always in the footnotes, in time, I can achieve health, too. See? I can be in despair in time. All right. I mention that because that notion of freedom is relevant, all right, now in a way that Kierkegaard would be very uncomfortable with. Right? In other words, he's talking in some sort of peculiar spiritual, in other words, Kierkegaard is doing a kind of Protestant equivalent of what happens in the Catholic Church when the host is put back in the tabernacle. Right? In other words, there's this miracle here, but it's not a miracle. It's changing the stones in the building. Right? It's not. In other words, there is this transubstantiation, but it's confined to the church and the tabernacle. Do you see? And in his own way, Kierkegaard is effectively, if not maybe even more radically than he would if he were a Catholic, he has confined what I call in faith and philosophy the trans-subjectification that Kierkegaard is talking about on the analogy, not so much to Thomistic transubstantiation, but the consubstantiation of Luther, which would be more in keeping with where Kierkegaard was at. But anyway, the point being that he, like maybe more extremely so, more radically so than Catholicism, he wants to confine the transformation that he's involved in as his understanding of what Christianity is. He wants to confine that in such a way that it does not transform thought. It does not transform reason. It's self-avowedly, self-admittedly an absurd idea, if it is an idea. Right? So in a certain sense, it's no idea. It's another way of. So yes, there is an analogy to what Kierkegaard is doing in the Thinking Now Occurring, a very important analogy. Right? The analogy, what started me on that, is that we have leapt, right? That the irreversibility of the world at this point is so real that it is effectively, if not just in principle, it is certainly effectively, there is no other side. There is effectively no alternative. There is no going back. And therefore we have, in a much more comprehensive sense, willy-nilly, so to speak, which I think is a good way of putting it, we find ourselves having leapt. Right? We find ourselves a certain. Now here I can play with this in a kind of free fall. You see? Okay. All of which leads up. So to try and concretize this a little bit, this acquisition is now seen to be transformed into thought's identity with energy itself. Right? That is, thought is identified with its appearance itself, transcending the transcendent difference of merely formally tautologous thinking, wherein energy is energy alternated, essentially without end, with thought in its identification with an essentially indifferent matter. Energy itself, concretely, is the transcendent comprehension of the identity of what remains to be seen without the passage of time in essence, without therefore an alternative route outside of thought. Energy itself is the end of the alternative to thought, just as this now is an end of the alternative to now, like then. Right? Occurring now to thought for the first time in history as the appearance itself of the unconditioned reality of its object. In this thinking now occurring, it is the same as an essentially new identity, to be conceived in essence, to appear in existence. The form of thought's comprehension of its identity with the transcendent energy of the universe is time itself, through which thought comprehends the appearance itself of what has occurred, a complete change in essence now appearing. Through the form of time itself, the object of the past is rendered transparent, transformed, relativized in essence, which may be expressed as. All right? And so now I use some, I want to say quasi-physical, not that I want to say that it isn't physical, but on the other hand, I say quasi-physical because I want to say that I'm taking kind of intellectual license with the precise use of the terms, because the E here, the normal meaning of E would be electric charge, and I'm using it in that sense, but I don't mean to specify 1.602 times 10 to the minus 11, okay? So conceptualizing the symbols, if you want to call it that. E times T, T standing here for time, or E identified with time would be another way I would read it verbally, equals mc squared. So it's a modification of Einstein's famous fundamental relativity formula, E equals mc squared. Energy equals mc squared.
And wait. Just what is the significance of the modification? That the way, I mean, because the way you've just explained it,
right.
It's just a specification of energy in terms of charge, and then somehow that charge over time. I just depending on what you mean by over time. Yeah, through, but it's in the sense that its value is determined by how long it's in duration.
Okay, all right.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. As far as that goes. I mean, I want to say more than that, but that's
all right.
okay.
Okay.
For
I'm just trying to read the
okay. Okay. So now the move I make here, the first move I make on the second line down, is that in effect I divide both sides. Yeah, that's what I do. In effect I divide both sides by E. I get rid of the E in front of the T. I put one under the mc squared, and that's okay, starting with ET, right? But the result, I translate that into T equals mc. Okay.
So, but that means that E equals C.
Yes, in effect. Yeah. That's right. It means that charge is ultimately reducible to the terms that are found in velocity. The ultimately reducible relationship between distance. Velocity is distance over time, miles per second. Right? Okay. So distance over time. And so here's what I would say. I want to say. So if you allow that, right, then if you allow the effective reduction of the notion of charge to the relationship between time and distance, then it cancels out one of the C's, which is the velocity, which is the speed of light, how many miles or meters that light travels in a second. Okay, and that leaves us with T equals mc, and then translate. So let me if I can take advantage of this board that I hardly ever use. If I if time equals mass times the speed of light in traditional terms, right? Or mass moving at a certain velocity, right? It effectively is T squared over Lm, right? And what I want to say about that is that that if I take the square root of that equation, t squared over L
What's the
equals
L?
Length. Yeah, okay. I'm using what are the common terms to reduce. In other words, conceptually, you can reduce the second to t as time. You can reduce the meter to L as length.
Okay.
All right, and m remains mass. Or to be consistent, reduce the kilogram to m as mass. Right. So in the international system of scientific notation, they use S for T, kilogram for M, and meter for length. Right? So it's just another way of putting it, which is a little neater conceptually. All right. And if I take this, all right, so I'm saying that's what that equals. Now when I take the square root of that, right?
Wait, I'm sorry, what's the arrow doing after the parentheses?
It's just, it's my symbol of just translating this into that. I'm just saying this translates into that.
Tm translates into t squared over L equals m.
Yeah, because C is...
C.
Yeah. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay. C is L over T. All right, so that gives us t squared over L equals m,
Okay.
and T equals square root of Lm. Right? That's the... See? All right. Now, it turns out, now, you have to understand, I did this formula. This formula seemed to me, as the writer, correct 25, 30 years ago, whenever I did it. In my ongoing conversation with Steve Hoth, who some of you are aware of, I've been having now for several years, electronic conversation with this research biologist out at the University of Cincinnati Medical School, who's willing to talk to me at this great length because in addition to being a research biologist and a practical working scientist, he's also got a mind. And he thinks, and he has a kind of interest in philosophy. He's a Kantian by instinct and by some kind of serious investigation, which creates problems. Nevertheless, anyway, it's a great conversation because I get a lot out of it, not being a scientist, right? Not having that kind of training. And on the other hand, it's a great, in my mind, among other things, it's a great testing ground in working with a scientific practitioner who has a conceptual reach. It's a great testing ground in a certain sense of the thinking now occurring. So
you should tell everybody too that he's got a certain insanity that all of us share too.
Well, it's
Which
yes.
is-
He has to be
he-
corrected from time to time.
No, which is that he pays you money.
Oh well, I don't see the relevance of that.
Well,
Oh, okay. Well, good.
we all pay you money.
Well, that's okay. So you
Including
should.
Hope.
Well, you should write him a note and tell
Hope
him
pays
that.
you money. We must all be.
I,
Go ahead.
anyway, the point being, I mention it because here's a good example at a very key place in the text where I say in general I was willing to engage in this conversation with him, not just because I like to consider problems, which I do, but also, as I say, because I thought, well, this might be interesting testing ground for the thinking. Well, it turns out in the course of our conversation, actually at day one, although it fell by the wayside and it came up more recently, he takes very seriously the notion that Maxwell's definition of charge. And Maxwell's definition of charge was this, which was abandoned in 20th century physics, the reason being that no one could understand it. In other words, Maxwell defined charge as the square root of length times mass, and they couldn't get their mind around it, right? So now wait a minute, you say, well, of course we can come up with something, but the point is, as of today, no one in physics knows what charge is. I mean, no one. They just have a symbol for it, right? You have a symbol for current, you say, Q or I or what, depending on the context. But if you say conceptually, what is it? There's no answer. for Maxwell, this was the definition of charge. So what's interesting to me is that, in effect, this formula, which I laid down on the page somewhat boldly, right, 25 years ago, I now have a very easy way of relating it to the history of scientific thought, right? And what's interesting is the hitherto unintelligibility of Maxwell's notation for charge. And what I think would be new, I don't think this is going to be in Maxwell, is that what Maxwell understood by charge is in the thinking now occurring, it is equated with, as it were, it is identified as time. Time is charge. Now, let me say one more thing about Maxwell's idea of charge, which is different conceptually than the current, if you'll pardon the expression, idea of charge, or the subsequent idea of charge in physics, and that is Maxwell had the notion that charge was the product of displacement in space. Okay? And that notion has been eclipsed by the notion of the electromagnetic field, right, basically. But if we go back to Maxwell and his notion of displacement in space, what I like about it, and this is going to come up again in different contexts in today's reading, okay, it's a notion that is compatible formally with the symbol of one of the fundamental aspects of the thinking now occurring, namely that the circle is not simply a matter of continuous points. That the discrete, going back to where Bernadette Roberts leaves off, you see, but yes, there is uniqueness, right? But it remains for her at the level of the empirical as opposed to the beyond, right? The unknown and so forth. If you deny that distinction, if you say that the leap in reality, not just the rift in time, you might say the ultimate, essentially new leap in reality is such that discreteness, that simplicity, that singularity, that is an absurd spiritual as opposed to natural ideal in Kierkegaard, that uniqueness, that simplicity is absolutely beginning, and absolutely beginning. That is, with no reservations, with no possibility of retreat, of withdrawal, and so forth. And at least the conceptual notation of Maxwell is compatible conceptually with that notion, that displacement, you see, in space, that separate, that you see what I'm saying? That separation is for Max. And so why did he say square root, which really what makes it difficult, because LM is not so inconceivable. LM is like the basic, it's in the formulas for momentum, it's the stuff thing. It's mass for a distance, right? And then over t, I think it's momentum, right? Mass for a distance per second is momentum, right? But mass for a distance, but square root, you see? But conceptually, it makes a lot of sense. In other words, he must have been thinking. In other words, it's the square root charge, the square root of charge, right? Let's simplify it. The root, as it were, for Maxwell, of charge is this discreteness of entities in space. Right? That was the notion. Yeah.
Your circle that is not continuous.
Right.
The way I think of it, and I just see if we're with you, is the very interesting notion that continuity itself is only defined as the transfinite acts of discreteness. In other words, in Dedekind, every real number is a cut that is an absolute distinction between what's on one side and what's on the other, and the sum of all cuts is continuum.
Okay.
So you have a very, very nice fundamental paradox about the relationship between...
I'm so glad you said this. This is another thing I was thinking about Peirce, which I wanted to say, and now you've given me the opportunity. I was saying in a different context before how, in some sense, there's an anticipation, as it were, of the thinking now occurring in American thought. Right? There is the acknowledgement that there is no simple hard fact. We don't start, as we do in Hegel, with necessity. Right? There is an unending, although infinitely diminishing, but there's an unending prolongation of spontaneity in American thought. Even though there's increasing regularity, the flip side of that is that we never get so regular that we're terminated. You know what I'm saying? We never actually come to the end, even though the end is there. And without the end, there'd be no direction. So in pragmatism, there is a direction, right? And you could say, in a certain sense, there is a meaning to existence in pragmatism, right? And another way of putting it, for those of you who are into this issue, is that teleology got a bad rap in modern science, you see? But not in Peirce. Peirce has, and here's where Aristotle is coming back, seriously coming back, not only in quantum mechanics, as Heisenberg points out, but he's already been anticipated to come back in Peirce's pragmatism, right? Because what is the characteristic thing if you think of when you think of Aristotle in science? Teleology, right? That there is an end, right? Which is there, the actuality, which is there before the realization in time of thing we call potentiality toward that. You see? Okay. So Peirce has in his notion of evolution a form of teleology. I mean, we're not going back to the eternal static telos of Aristotle, you see, but we have a teleology. That is, we have an eternity which is coming into being, so to speak. You know, but we never actually get it into being, right? But it's becoming more. Things are becoming more and more unchanging, more and more regular, more and more eternal, more and more real. You see, more and more like what Plato thought was there from the get-go or before the get-go. Okay. Now, what's this got to do with what you just said? So I'm reading again, browsing in Peirce, and I went back over that. So now I'm going to say what I think is another, as it were, type anticipation in American thought of this new world consciousness. Peirce says that a thought, as it were, is without meaning. Because a thought, taken as a discrete something or other, okay, is not to be confused with the continuum of thinking. It's only when you have the continuum of the thoughts, of the series of thoughts, it's only at that level that you get into meaning. Okay? So it seems to me, in some sense, if I'm hearing you right, it's a kind of an application, epistemologically, as it were, of the distinction you just made between the discrete points and the continuum.
Well, I mean, mine was that there is no duality between the discrete and the continuous.
Okay.
Okay. Well, in order to give an account of the continuous, you would end up with a transfinite with many discrete points.
Okay.
In order to give an account for what a discrete point is, you divide the continuum.
Okay. All right. I don't know whether I should try and address that directly. Let me address it indirectly through Peirce because that's more relevant, I think, to what I want to do. But let me apply your view of it, and I think in some sense it would be shared by Peirce. That in order to get to any given thought, you would have to divide the continuum, the continuum of thought.
The continuum of thought is that.
Okay. Okay. If you bear in mind that thought in this discrete sense is meaningless for Peirce, right? That the meaning is, I want to say, that it supervenes upon the discrete moments.
Another language, but that's
okay. All right. So what's the relevance? The relevance of the thinking now occurring is that, or the proximity of American thought. Another example of it would be that the thinking now occurring is precisely the availability, and this is where I think we would be, at least potentially, in disagreement, the availability of the discrete thought that is meaningless is immediate. Right? In other words, it does not require the cutting through of a continuum. I think that's what the thinking now occurring. One way of understanding what the thinking now occurring is saying, in effect, right? So when I talk about that thought's identity is now its object, right? And that there is, as it were, a kind of giftedness of the object to thought wherein it has its identity in some way absolutely here and now. It's as if we were speaking in these terms, as if we have an immediate availability to that meaningless level of thought. And the only point I would like to make, not the only point, but an important point I'd like to make by making this reference back to Peirce, is that the fact that it's meaningless, even in Peirce, does not mean that it isn't thought. Right? You see what I'm saying? In other words, there is, for Peirce, a grasp, as it were, a contact of the thought with the reality. Now, because continuity is not to be set aside in pragmatism the way it is being set aside in the thinking now occurring, because of that difference, consistent with that difference, in Peirce's analysis, and this should remind you of the fact that in Aristotle there's no first now. Well, analogously, because time is a continuum in Aristotle, you see, that is divided up by these nows. So in Peirce, there is no first thought. There is no thought between which, no matter how far back I go, how far down I go, however you want, whatever direction you want to pick. Here's the reality, and I'm going to think the reality, right? Well, in Peirce, what I need to understand is thought is a continuum composed of these discrete thoughts, and no matter how far I go, as it were, back in thought, to the rear in thought, toward its starting place, which presumably is the reality, which is something, pardon the expression, really different than the thought that's of it, I'm never going to come to a point where I can't insert a previous thought, a less clear thought. You see, that's another way of doing it, right? So in other words, just as the universe is getting more and more regular, more and more finished, more and more real, more and more determinate, more and more specified, more and more eternal, as it were, okay? Analogously, epistemologically, the thought, the current thought, both individually, I think Peirce would say both individual, your thought, the reason why your options are decreasing with age, it's not simply a negative thing. I mean, you're becoming more, you are more and more clear on who you are. It's a frightening thought, right? But in other words, because the idea in Peirce is that the development of thought is constructive. It is evolutionary, right? But whether you take it personally or whether you take it cosmologically. So one of the implications of that would be that just as the universe is a little more dreamlike the further back I go in time, I'm a little more dreamlike the further back I go in life, right? You see, and that's not simply a psychological matter. See, that has to do with the nature of thought, the nature of time. You see, that it tends to become more real. It tends to realize the overwhelming potentiality at first, you see, becomes more and more actualized. Another way, put it in Aristotelian terms.
Do you see Whitehead, for instance, as a kind of generalization of Peirce in that way? In the sense that for him, all of the ultimate realities are these processes of concrescence, of becoming more real. That the universe is made up of these kind of abstract atoms that are in the process of literally becoming more real by involving by defining their relationships to all the other ones until they become concrescent, at which point they simply enter into their participation in other processes. Just striking me the way you're describing Peirce, the Whiteheadian thing is really, because Whitehead is a peculiar kind of British version of American pragmatism.
Right. Yeah. Well, I can see the influence. Whitehead is another. Whitehead, like Wittgenstein, is somebody I haven't looked at in 30 years, but that makes sense as far as it goes. Process philosophy is a very American thing, as well as So yes, it might be a. I'm suspecting again. I have a kind of. I just want to make a confession. I have a kind of prejudice against. Probably the reason I didn't go back to Whitehead was I was not too taken conceptually with that notion of process, and I generally am not. And I think it might be an overdetermination of Peirce. That's what I suspect. That would be my hypothesis. If I were to go back and read the text, I would be guessing
That it's overdetermined.
it's an overdetermined purse. That purse, yes, there is a process, but I don't know whether he would want to
Create these little
Yeah.
monads. I mean, because
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
Leibniz plus
yeah.
it's purse plus Leibniz.
Yeah, yeah. That's what I'm suspecting. But I say that not having looked at the text in quite some time.
So
All right. So yeah.
I haven't understood a lot of what we went through, some of what we went through today with physics and this tangent into purse, but I think the symbol here is important in terms
Okay.
of continuity of discrete points.
Okay.
So what's essential here is that these discrete points allow for the world of difference and concrete specificity of individual beings.
Well, they are it. I mean, it's
They are.
as it were, a symbol of
Right.
of that.
Right.
Yeah.
And yet we're not stuck in a kind of modernist or postmodernist nothing because of the world of just different of just endless differences.
Right.
Because there is a continuity. It is a circle, in a sense.
Well, that's where I was going to go. Where is your version of the discontinuous points different from this passage this kind of amazing passage in which you say the object as absolute formal appearance is the locus of that contradiction by which thinking in the past denies to reality its own essence in an absolute form in order to preserve itself from non-existence. The essential non-existence of the object in itself is the condition of its intelligibility, in which it is clearly perceived to exist in distinction from other things, but not in distinction from thought itself. That's that seems to me one of the clearest shots at modernist problem.
What page is that?
315.
Okay.
But I'm not clear how your discontinuous circle isn't this distinction from other things, but not in distinction from thought itself. I mean, you seem to be saying,
because I think I want to see on 315. Whereabouts does it start?
it's on the top there.
Oh yeah. Conceive it. Oh, near the top. Okay.
Well, what I read just
Yeah.
the object
Okay.
is absolutely formal. I mean, it seems to me what that is saying is that the modernist sense or postmodernist sense in which you can only understand what an object is through its comparisons with other objects makes it possible for thought to possess itself in its intimacy with objects as real, where the objects lose their own individuality, specificity by becoming dependent upon each other for their distinctness. So they're able to become distinct from each other, but they get completely embroiled with what thought is. So thought doesn't know, thought doesn't know its own difference from objects. So what I'm not completely hearing how your discontinuous circle.
Okay.
isn't
Well,
a
if I just
description.
focus on that sentence which you
Yeah,
quoted
right.
on page 315, and I think it's the last sentence in the paragraph, right, which is the
Right, that's the
key
right.
thing, right? Okay. The essential non-existence of the object in itself is the condition of its right. And this, as you say, is a shot at modernity.
Yeah.
Okay. So what is this? How would I
How-
verbalize
how's that
this
in
over
relation
against
to-
that?
right.
I would say the essential existence of the object in itself, as opposed to its non-existence in itself. Right. So in the thinking now occurring, every object has its existence in itself,
Without its comparative nature,
without
relationship to the field of differences.
both without its needing to be compared,
Yeah.
without being essentially, without its relation to others being one of comparison,
Yeah, well,
right, and not only essentially existing in itself, related to other things, but not comparatively. I would say more to flesh it out positively, freely in its very being related to other entities, right? But not comparatively because it has its essential existence as such in its being, right? The being that it is an essential existence in the way in which is said not to be the case here in modern thought. And then the closing of that new kind of circle is also, unlike modernity, that object is distinct from thought itself. And it's distinct, and the way in which it's distinct from thought itself is that in some sense, although again the language here is the problem, but we just do our best here, it is prior to thought, right? That is to say, its identity is the only identity that thought has. There is no self-consciousness. There is no identity to the thought beholding the object other than the object in thought. That's when I'm saying, go back to my old-fashioned camera idea, that's when the schema is taken away, and the problem with the metaphor is that it breaks down because I have to go through a little motion to do that. You know what I'm saying? But if you attempt to conceive of a relationship between that of which the picture is taken and the picture, there is no picture, the identity of which is not.
Okay, now put together the synthesis of the fact with that kind of autonomy of the object in relationship to thought.
Oh, you're very good. That's a great question. That's a great question. And it's not an easy question to answer. That's why it makes it such a good question. How is it that we could be constructing a world in a completely selfless way? Would be another way of formulating the question.
Well,
What do you mean by fact?
well, he has facts that are synthetic.
Right.
Yeah.
And we talked about that at the beginning. And at the same time, he has the objects, which are facts.
Yeah.
Okay, which are the
Factuality
only way in which thought has itself is through its having itself as the object. Okay, and yet it is synthesizing the object.
Right.
So you're saying that that translates it. How could there be the synthesis of the object by a selfless process?
Yeah. How could thought be in an unfettered way, in a way that's a little tough to swallow, actually, because it makes me super responsible would be an understatement. Right? So how does thought have the complete responsibility, as it were, of creating the world, and is doing so absolutely without self, but
without being a synthetic, transcendent, Kantian.
Well, synthetic, but not.
Well,
not a transcendent subject.
Right.
Forget transcendent. Not a transcendental subject.
Not transcendental.
That's what you meant.
But I'm saying, but in the Husserlian sense, but in the Kantian sense, that the subject is creating the world. The subject is creating the world through a process of synthesis.
Right, but in today's assignment, I think that transcendental subject of apperception dies. Undergoes
So
death.
The subject totally changes.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm just,
It dies.
I'm just putting them all together.
Yeah. No, but so how does that happen?
You do it.
Well, no, I don't know whether I can do it. I think we've kind of done it for openness. In other words, what are we talking about? We're talking about a thinking, speaking loosely now, whose whole purpose is to construct the world. That is, it has no purpose of its own. I mean, the world is what this thinking does. I mean, or doing the world, if I can borrow a little doing from Roberta, right? I mean, there are points of contact. I was rooting for her all the way to the last chapter. Right? This doing of the world is what thought is. It's and thought has no time out. I'm reminded of the parable of the talents. Right? The servant gets the talents, and what is he to do? Well, he's not to worry about it. It's not his talent. Right? It's his master's talent. So when his master comes back, what does he expect? He wants a return on his money. He wants the guy to have invested it. The only one in the parable of the talents, the only guy who gets in trouble is the guy who returns the original investment to the master. And why did he bury the talent? He was covering his rear end. He was thinking about himself. Right? And there's no room for that. So I don't know whether it makes the question depends on what you mean by answer the question.
Well,
but I can
it's-
rephrase the question in those
holding all
terms.
the
I think it's
pieces
more
and
accessible.
juggling
Yeah.
in front of
I think it's a little more accessible that way, right? So,
Could
is
we-
it possible? Yeah,
Can we go back to page 325?
sure.
And this.
I do. Oh boy,
no,
we
I
got to
mean-
move on. But go on.
Yeah, I understand. Well, I'm
Okay.
going to take you right up to page 336.
Okay, good. All right, good.
The final solution of this equation is that time equals charge. Is that right?
Yeah. Right. So let me finish off the conceptual part of that, which we got kind of bogged down in the symbolism.
Yeah.
So that translates into what I'm talking about here as energy itself. You might call it, if you look at Einstein's formula, which I don't want to get bogged down in it now because I just want to move on, but we can come back to it if we need to. But if you were to verbalize Einstein's formula, that capital E is potential energy. Okay? So what I'm saying in effect is the potential energy is giving way in the thinking now occurring to charge, which in this context I want to call actual energy. Again, focusing on the here and now, so to speak, the absoluteness of the here and now of the thinking now occurring. Right? And in that sense, the potential energy is not at the foundation of this conceptualization of energy.
Well,
Yeah, go on.
So I'd like you to relate that to what's on page 336, which is about a dozen lines from the bottom. The transcendent form of this thinking is time itself.
I got to find it. 336.
Page 336.
Okay, about a dozen from the bottom, you said?
10. The sentence begins, the transcendent form of this thinking is time.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Time itself.
Okay, I got it.
Now, is that the verbal formulation of the notion that mathematically time equals charge?
Well, it's related. That is, what this little formula is saying is that time equals charge, and what this sentence is talking about is that time, understood implicitly, that is being equated with charge here, is the transcendent form of this thinking. It is going back to this phenomenological understanding of transcendence now. In other words, it is the object. I could put it another way. It is the essentially objective form of this thinking is time itself. So yes, it's related, but the charge idea is related to this sentence through the notion of time itself. And time itself here is the I could put it this way, I think. It's the transcendent identity of this thinking.
Well,
Is time.
all the
Yeah, which I like.
looking at this.
Yeah.
This
Oh, there it is.
this drawing on from-
Similar.
Sorry, whatever. With the discontinuity
Yeah.
in the
Right.
continuity
Right.
being the appearance of transcendental essence of existence
Correct.
in time.
Right.
Now, what I'm trying to get at here is that formulaically, does the new thinking transcend difference by I was going to say appropriating time. All right.
Well, you know that's wrong.
Well, I know it's wrong, but I'm using that term
Right.
just for a purpose. But,
Okay.
But I mean, if essentially the new thinking is thinking time itself, then is that the way we get around, all the differences that one could cite?
Well, I'm not sure.
Now and then, contradiction or not, and all those other things. It's not
It's a way.
not to obliviate time, but it's to elevate time in a sense to thought.
Okay. Right. But
Is that
the
what-
time. Well, I'm trying to avoid being overly pedantic, but so in other words, I think you're using the word difference here in at least a a different way than I would necessarily need to hear it. In other words, the difference between self and other, that a certain set of differences belongs to the past. But on the other hand, it's very important to say that differences which are not comparative, which are not oppositional in the sense of here and there, self and other, now and then, it's not that all difference goes away, quite the contrary, that there is a kind of infinitization of difference in the thinking now occurring, and the form of that, I don't want to say set, for the want of a better term, set of infinitely different things, the form of that is time itself, or maybe a little more deeply, that infinite set of different things is time, not just the but I don't mind saying forma, but I mean to push the point a little further.
So the schema would be what is called in contemporary postmodern parlance systematicity. The systematicity falls away as the schema. That comes out of the way, and the things are now there in as they are, without having been subservient to the system which makes them meaningful.
Right. Yes, and so that's why if Peirce says that thought only becomes meaningful at the, that thought only becomes meaningful at the level of continuity.
You say fine.
Fine. We don't need that.
We don't need meaning.
Yeah, we don't need meaning. We don't need continuity in that sense, and that's what the system offers.
Right. Sure.
Yeah.
Is there any possibility of disagreement?
My Dedekind continuum is in a whole other plane.
Okay.
Actually, I ought to withdraw it from that.
Okay, but it was it served its purpose.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
But I mean, I hold to it, but for whole other purposes.
Okay.
Not in disagreement with this whole setup.
Okay.
What's the possibility of disagreement in this, you think?
Well, I would say that the thinking is essentially not a matter of agreement or disagreement. In other words, analogously, you either see that red exit sign or you don't. I mean,
well, you may see it, but I may not.
Okay, fine.
How do we resolve
But you don't see it.
How do we resolve
Why do we need to resolve it?
Well, normally we would. I mean, especially if that's a fire alarm. Suppose that was a fire alarm going off, right? It
Okay.
You see it and I don't. Is it of any importance?
Well, it's not that it's no importance. I would tell you, we better get out of here. The fire alarm went off, and you would tell me you don't hear it, and I'd say, well, look, trust me, or something. I don't know what I would do. Maybe I hit you in the head and drag you out.
But often they're false alarms.
Well, no, wait a minute. Now you change. No, wait a minute. You just changed. No, you just changed the. No, you can't do that.
People sit
the
through
question
them
is
all
not
the
whether there's a real fire or not. It's a question whether the alarm is going off. That was your original.
Yes, and they're
Okay.
often false alarms. And believe me, in major buildings around this country, people sit right through them. They continue their meetings.
Okay, but I'm not sure the
They
relevance
ignore them.
of
And
that
there are other people who
observation.
evacuate.
So, therefore,
So what I'm saying is, if there's a fact, you're using that
right,
example. There's
Right.
a fact.
Right.
Either I see it or I don't.
right. Well,
I'm
that's nice
saying
to me
that
too.
people disagree on the imminent fact, whatever you want to call it. It's not imminence. It's something else. It's not mysticism, but it's right
Okay.
there.
I would say, I'll go back to my original answer. My original answer is that the thinking now occurring is not a matter of agreeing or disagreeing. Now, you want to say, well, in everyday life, people agree and disagree about things, right? If you want me to relate what I'm saying about the thinking now occurring to your very realistic objection, I would say that in principle, okay, in other words, part of what's new here, really new, is that in principle, the basis for that kind of everyday pragmatic agreeing and disagreeing that you're pointing to, which is part of our experience, like the walls that no longer, they still exist, there are still walls, right? And there are still wars, etc., right? But the ultimate justification for disagreement is gone in the thinking now occurring. The ultimate justification for barriers, walls that divide people from one another, you see, the justification is no longer there. Once you essentially eliminate self-reference, right, then the question essentially of disagreement is undermined. But it's essentially undermined. Is there a residual afterglow? Yeah. I mean, or after darkness or whatever. Yeah. But in principle, right? In other words, I mean, look, this is another way of putting this. See, this is another anticipation of what I'm saying here you find in Kant. Kant magnificently defined what the scientific enterprise is all about in a certain way. I mean, not to satisfy somebody like Dewey, perhaps, okay. But in a conceptual way he did, because Kant said that scientific truth, scientific knowledge, is in principle able to be validated by universally or concretely by the scientific community. Right? So that's why when you say you got cold fusion out in Utah, and some guy in Tokyo says, "Well, how'd you do that?" And, okay, well, he tries it and he doesn't get it, and the guy in London tries it, he doesn't get it. Then we say, no, we don't accept that, right? So, in principle, modern science is saying that true knowledge is not going to be able to be, in principle now, we're not talking about specifics, in principle it's going to be universally seen to be true, in principle. If it doesn't have at least that formality about it, then we don't even want to take it seriously. If it has that formality about it, we'll take it seriously until somebody can show, not simply not agree with it, but demonstrate to everybody else's satisfaction. You know what I'm saying? All right. So when I say we're beyond agreement and disagreement, I'm saying the thinking now occurring is beyond that, but that notion that it's conceivable in principle that all scientific minds would agree on what is able to be asserted to be known, right? That we need not disagree, in other words, is a self-conscious way of anticipating what I'm saying, that the very principle of the question of agreeing or disagreeing, right, is gone in this thinking, in principle.
In principle, I can see it's not going to be the case that you'll disagree about whether the sign is on. But I don't see how that means that in principle the difference between agreeing and disagreeing, the degrees of agreeing and disagreeing is gone. I don't see how that follows.
Well, if we live in a world in which we never encounter it.
We never encounter disagreement.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we would think it would be agreeing. We'd be just...
We think we're in Iraq.
We'd be just seeing. No. Because there's a certain modern paranoia.
Nobody disagreed.
Yeah, by force they didn't disagree, and in fact they did disagree, right? But they couldn't speak their mind, right? So there was a dichotomy between what they thought and what they were able to say, right? Okay.
That's the scary part about this.
It is.
This whole imminent.
It is scary. If you were to, yes, this is very scary. If you
I
are
was fine in Leahy's hands. Leahy's benevolent hands.
Well, but this is
It
true.
isn't in anybody's hands. The point is that in principle, it doesn't matter what they're in any hands.
In the sense in which he's concerned about it. Right.
In the intermediary,
That's
it really is dangerous because before you get there, somebody's going to co-opt it. That is to say, on the basis of the authority of their understanding of the thinking now occurring, they will enforce one position over another. That is a possibility. That's really what you're learning. But that's not really fair to it, because it's really attempting to be so obscure that nobody would be able to get it at some intermediary position.
Now I figured out what the justification. You should take comfort in the fact that you can't read
don't
it.
take any comfort at
why the
all.
language was used the way it was, because it makes it impenetrable.
Well, it's a classical esotericism that's going on here. That is to say, self-secret. Nobody's able to produce a popular version of the thinking now occurring, which they can use to overcome or beat over their head and get the postmodernists out of the university, which maybe you like to do.
Well, because this undermines the university.
Yeah, really.
Right. So
Really. It undermines the university as well as the postmodernists, absolutely.
Right. But let's try. I mean, this is all very relevant, but we have to try and make some attempt at this text.
But Dave, before you do, I think this is fascinating. If what you're saying is somehow that 25 years ago, before you got into any of these mathematical elaborations of this thinking, that what you wrote down here on page 325 anticipated a lot of the things that you'd come up with in Foundation. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying, yeah, something broadly like that. I'm saying, more particularly, I was saying that, I mean, what I'm saying is that I did this is a kind of primarily conceptual notation. It's a notation of a certain conceptual arrangement of things. I'm saying I have since discovered within the scientific symbolization historically, I've found that this is translatable, right, into terms that people within the limitations, no one knows what charge is, but in other words, they would recognize the symbolism.
But you're saying
so it's not mysterious.
You're
in that
saying
sense.
further that the work that you and Hoth have done has resurrected Maxwell, or what?
Well, not quite, because I don't think that Maxwell is saying he's not making this equation. In other words, but I'm saying yes, it revisits something characteristic of Maxwell's thinking that in this new context is at least relevant. I mean, I don't think it's a question of going back to Maxwell scientifically in any simple sense, right? Okay. What to do? I just want to. I mentioned Ibn Sina there on 329. I don't want to take the time to go through this particular analogy I'm drawing here between the temptations of Christ and the history of thought, which I think has an interest, but I don't think it's necessary to do it. But I mentioned Ibn Sina on page 329, a little below the middle, otherwise known as Avicenna. And I wanted to mention in passing that his impact on Thomas is significant, or the comparison between Thomas and Avicenna or Ibn Sina is significant, because Ibn Sina's philosophy, he makes in his argument for God as being the necessary existent, as being the cause of the world of contingency. He basically, the simple way of understanding, he makes the argument that a cause and the effect have to be two different things. And if God is the cause of a world which is, as it were, totally defined as the sum total of contingent beings, and therefore it is itself contingent, then God must be not contingent. He must be a necessary being, not a contingent being. That's the basic argument. And so that's kind of relevant here, as the text tries to indicate. But the more general point I wanted to make is to illustrate something of what I'm talking about when I say to take that schema out altogether of the box. Avicenna made also the distinction between essence and existence. But when he made that distinction between essence and existence, he made it in favor of essence in a classically Aristotelian way. That is, existence for Avicenna was a matter of accident. Okay? And when Thomas gets a hold of this issue of the relationship between existence and accident, of course, existence and essence, as I pointed out to you in a different context, he elevates esse, the act of being, above essence. Okay? And a short and perhaps not quite technically correct way to do it would be that, but if you could make it correct by saying, in effect, he raises existence above essence. You see? Now, he doesn't directly raise existence in the modern sense above essence, because existence is temporal spatial, but in a way he does move it above there, because the essence is actualized by the act of being in which it participates, the esse, you see, and therefore, in effect, and this would be a good Thomistic way of putting it, in effect, you see, because the world is the effect of the causative power of the Creator, you see, he gives, in effect, to the world a level of actuality, you might say, you see, that existence takes on a level of reality and actuality that is not adequately presented in the notion that it is merely an accidental in its own nature. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, the fact that it does not exist of necessity in a Thomistic understanding does not mean that it is an accident. In fact, it is the result of the deliberate will of God to create it and to give to it, as he says, and which I stress in the Faith and Philosophy book, a certain being of its own, as it were. Right? So there's a, even in Thomas, not as extreme as in the thinking now occurring. Right? There's a because he's kind of pre-absolute self-consciousness. So he hasn't had a chance to go through it. He he's not coming out the other end, as it were, of absolute self-consciousness. He's kind of creating a setup for its possibility, not its necessity. Okay, and so because he's got a latent self-consciousness operating there in his own thinking, or a one that's not full grown, kind of youthful, prepubescent self-consciousness in Thomas, right? But nevertheless, the world has an actuality, a being of its own. What I was starting to say was, so in Thomas, there is already the very real, not accidental suggestion of the independent being of the world from God. Right? It's not simply a contingent versus necessary. Right? Okay. I just want to say that in passing, but I want to move through the text now. Just looking at the third moment in this little analogy on page 330, in the first paragraph beginning on 330, before now in history, faith is tempted a third time. This third temptation is no longer cast in the form of faith proving itself to thought. Faith is not tempted to exist theologically, nor to exist theologically. In the third temptation, which brings us to the modern period of faith in history, in modern thought, beginning with Descartes, faith is tempted to exist theoretically. And as soon as I reread this, I thought my friend Jim is going to right away object that, wait a minute.
Underline right here.
Yeah, he's going to object that you've been telling us all along that Descartes, when he undertook his scientific meditations, he set aside faith. He left it outside the door, so to speak, right? He did not subject it to the doubt, okay? And what I'm saying in effect, is that move, which I've already objected to fundamentally, cosmically, in doing the thinking now occurring, you see? In other words, one of the things we want to say about this thinking, everything else we can say about it, get rid of the schema, et cetera, that this is not in any way, unlike the phenomenology, which is otherwise superficially close to it, it does not eclipse the issue of God, you see, scientifically. In that little blurb I put about, that was provoked by our little discussion about Husserl and Catholicism and so forth, I don't know whether you read that, but the author of that blurb concludes, of course, there were all these Catholics in the Husserl circle, and he was kind of amused by that fact, bemused by it, I guess it was more like it. And they were all interested in religion and so forth, but of course they understood the difference, this is the key thing, between science and religion as a worldview. You see? Okay. So thinking now occurring, there's a difference that belongs to the past, right? So faith is not an alternative to science. That's one way of reading this. And so what I'm saying is that when Descartes makes, in effect, a kind of nice, gentle little what seems like a personal move, but remember, he's acting on behalf of mankind. He's acting qua universal humanity. He allows, as it were, faith to remain outside of the issue of scientific knowledge. And of course, that issue is magnified in Kant. And then it's kind of, what's the word? It's kind of, there's a word for this, what Hegel does to the whole tradition. I mean, he foxes it, he turns the tables on it. So Hegel trumps it. No, there's another. Descartes modestly, Kant programmatically rules faith off from science, right? And for Kant, it becomes equivalent to moral. But then you already see what's about to happen. You see, in other words, Hegel's going to bring the scientific and the moral together. He's going to bring a faith now conformed, you see, to, this is why Kierkegaard is going right up the wall. He's got no options. He's completely, he's in a desperate predicament, and he's no fool. You understand? So, in other words, the reason he's so extreme is that he realizes that there are no options at this point in history, right? Because, yes, faith is coexistent with science, but this faith has now been reduced to reason, to morality. You see, in other words, as long as it conforms within the limits of reason alone, that's religion. You see, that's genuine, true faith, moral faith, true religion. In other words, as long as you don't rock the boat, right? And then Hegel says, well, if we're going to go that far, let's identify the two, right? Why not? Because it's already been tamed. You see, it's already been tamed of its irrational, immoral elements, if I put it in terms of Kant's analysis. Okay, so so this right. So it's by leaving faith outside of the doubt. All right. That's, in one sense, it seems to be a good idea, but in another sense, it creates the. Speaking of the continuity between American thought and European thought, it creates the possibility of the separation of church and state. You see? Now, there are many good pragmatic reasons for that, and we understand why the passion of Thomas Jefferson, because people were killing each other. There was a lot of bloodletting over whether you were a Lutheran or a Protestant and so forth and so on, you see? So, was there a negative side to that? Yeah. But it raises the deeper question, is there ever, I'll put it to you another way, isn't there an American religion? Isn't there a civic religion? Can you have the state, you see, without some kind of faith? So the American
property.
Huh? Well, whatever. Or it's called being in general, or it's called the idea of God minus the specifics that would offend anybody. So we got a totally acceptable idea of God, except the atheists got a little bit. I think it's going to solve the problem. Right? So I think you could be an atheist and accept this. Right?
Well, that's an interesting point, because you can accept the thinking now occurring,
right?
But you can't accept the history that is the proof of the thinking now occurring. I mean, the thinking now occurring doesn't need any proof.
Okay.
You could say, I think, but if this text proves the thinking now occurring, or shows the history that leads up to it, or the essential move being the obvious appearance of the transcendental essence of existence. So the thinking now occurring, if you could isolate it from its history, might be acceptable to an atheist. But the understanding of why the thinking now occurring is,
or how,
right, wouldn't be acceptable to an atheist.
Mm-hmm. So, well, if the atheist was doing the thinking now occurring, what would be the problem then?
Yeah, but a smart atheist could do it.
Okay.
I don't know if they.
It's like there's a transparent slide that's been put back in the camera.
There's a history to atheism too, isn't there?
Yeah, but I think a smart atheist would have to admit, if he's a real serious smart atheist, that without Christianity it doesn't make any sense to be an atheist.
Right. That was the beginning of atheism.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
I don't
Well, it depends
Like
where
new
you're
and
talking
old.
now.
It's the same.
Right.
Oh,
Okay.
no, it's
Okay.
the same. It's the same.
Here was a passage that challenged me a little bit, so I'm going to. I want to call it to your attention because it bothered me to read it this way, and I might always rewrite. I always reserve. I never will, but I reserve the right in principle to rewrite this. At page 332, toward the bottom, about 8 lines up from the bottom. What now occurs for the first time in history is absolute opposition to modern thought. Now, the reason that bothered me and challenges me to explain myself is that if you've been paying attention, I'm saying that oppositional thinking is passé.
Yeah.
So.
But you modify it.
Well, I do. That's correct. You're right. But I think we should pause on it because, yes, it's important to be modified as an absolute opposition to modern thought. Okay. It is not, but formally essential opposition to the substantiality of modern thought. Not that is essentially juridical or intramural opposition, which leaves it essentially uncontradicted, but an opposition that transforms in essence the substance of thought from being absolute to being explicitly historical. If I were to say that really simply, I think that the opposition, therefore, is merely a matter of opposition in fact. It's not. You see what I'm saying? It's not intrinsically opposed to modern thought, but it is insofar as modern thought holds to its own identity. But I go on to say this is a material opposition to thought itself, appearing in thought's essence, which I kind of like that line, so that it is clearly perceived that the substance of thought is not there to begin with in essence for thought, but is in essence what appears in existence in thought. The key thing on the oppositional question is that it's a material opposition to thought itself, appearing in thought's essence. So in other words, it's as if thought absolutely opposes itself. Right? That is, it moves as it were altogether beyond itself. It is, in that sense, probably you could say. I think I could say. I don't know whether I say it in effect here. Clearly, we see the substance of thought is not there to begin with. In essence, for thought, it's a kind of transubstantiation of thought itself. You see. Now, the reason I hesitate to say that right here at this point in the text is because when I'm reading this particular passage, I'm thinking, well, but I'm really talking about that the substance of thought is not there to begin with, but is in essence what appears in the existence of thought. You see. But actually, in terms of gamma, that's not
It appears in existence itself.
what is appearing in existence itself, the world as it is now the objective identity of thought, is the transubstantiation of thought, because it is thought's identity, and it is transubstantiation. It is now the body itself, as I later will say, and I already begin to say in gamma.
By the way, speaking of the atheist, on page 341.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you're preparing class.
What's that?
I'm glad you're preparing class. Go on.
As I was saying, on page 341,
Right.
You say that the thinking.
Whereabouts?
This
Whereabouts?
is
The big sentence.
I don't know, about 12 lines down from the
Okay.
top. So that means discounting it for my override.
Well, there are two paragraphs on that page too.
Defender, in essence. Well, that's another thing about this page, by the way.
Okay.
But,
In the second paragraph on that page?
What?
Oh, right.
The first paragraph.
Okay.
The first incomplete paragraph.
Okay.
It says it starts with the line, defender in essence to the end.
Okay.
That-
I got it.
But that thinking, beginning now in essence for the first time, is answerable neither to God,
Right.
nor to self,
Right.
nor to the world.
Right.
So that should make.
Yes. Yes.
So I mean,
Well, and it's related to the answer that I gave to Chuck's question on the forum, which some of you may not have seen yet. But Chuck raised the question. It's a rather intricate question, but one of the key elements in the question is that the idea of God or God is still in play. Is God a being? Is God his own to be? Is Thomas that kind of thing, right? And in effect, I'm saying to Chuck is that we're not. The thinking now occurring is not thinking about God. It is thinking God, and therefore, analogously in this context, what you're pointing to, consistently and analogously, this thinking is not answerable to God, as if, again, there was that kind of separation or that kind of distance in the relationship between the thinking and God. Right?
But then going back to the last discussion, the thinking now occurring is the seeing of the appearance of the transcendental essence of existence, or it's so hard because I always jump back to thinking in the
Okay.
past, but I want to say the reason the reason when you can't say that, but the thinking now occurring is answerable to God. Is answerable, not in the sense of a present now dialogue that gives it its meaning or its essential truth, but it is in history God's or the appearance of the transcendental essence of existence that is what allows the thinking now occurring to be at all.
Yes. But it
But
wasn't.
no longer.
It wasn't on behalf. The transcendental essence of existence appearing in time was not on an ego trip. Okay, in other words, the point was not right. And the New Testament makes this point. Right? In other words, not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," is going to come out all right. It's he who does the will of the Father. That's right. So it's not a question of response in that sense, right? It's a question of doing, right? And what is the will of the Father? Well, fundamentally, the will of the Father is to create the world. Right? So the gift that is given in creation and maybe heightened in the incarnation.
The work.
Right. Well, I don't like the word continuous, but right. Okay. Allow it for that.
It's
It's
discontinuous.
right. Whatever. Right. The continuous the continuous discontinuity of the work.
So okay, so this would be to state, as we've been talking about this a lot. It would not be the case, even though the thinking now occurring. The thinking now occurring is thinking existence. Thinking existence is thinking God. The transcendental essence of existence is thinking the world. Through thinking existence, in our thinking, in our minds, in our immediacy to the world. The performance of that work is not dependent upon the acknowledgement of the category. The transcendental essence of existence is the meaning behind the activity by which we're creating the world with our thinking. But that's not the crucial point. Even though in the past the issue for faith was always linked to the issue of belief in a particular set of propositions, or a set of articles about Jesus Christ, which is interpreted here as the transcendental essence of existence. So the thinking now occurring actually is totally transforming the notion of faith, so that it's no longer indissolubly linked to those articles of propositional belief. Is that so? Because that's the sticking point for us here. Is whether the name for this whole process has to be Jesus Christ.
I think so.
You think it does? So
well, it depends on what you mean by the name.
Well, all right.
All right. I mean, it's a little hairy. I mean, I think, or I would say, is it the name or the fact? See, I would say it's the fact of Jesus Christ is the key, is the irreducible.
Is the exit sign. The fact is the transparency of existence to our own thinking. That's supposed to be transparent now.
Right.
So it's not a matter of whether we happen to be conditioned to name that in the traditional manner.
Right. Right.
Well, why do you insist on Jesus Christ? Why don't you go with Word?
Well, he does.
Well, I do that too.
Well, would that
Well,
be
all right,
easier?
here, wait a minute.
Well, Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, and we don't say, how come we have to think Thomas Edison?
But T equals E.
Yeah, as a matter of, I think that's a good. That's what I was trying to. In other words,
what do you say?
whether we say that Thomas Edison is responsible for the light bulb.
Yeah, but that's
or whether we say so or not, or whether we even know. I mean, I'm sure many people turn on the light that have never heard of
And
Thomas
it might
Edison.
not even be true. I don't know.
Well, okay, but let's assume for the sake of argument it is.
T equals
But the
E,
fact
right?
that he invented it or promoted it is a fact, whether anybody acknowledges it or not.
But in terms of the spiritual significance of that fact, there's a genetic fallacy. We don't have to worship Thomas Edison. We don't know what relationship we should have to Thomas Edison by the mere fact that he invented the light bulb.
Well, I think every time you turn on the light, you're worshiping.
Depends on what you mean by worship here.
Well, okay, all right. Well, let's take it a little bit slowly. You give a history in Novitas Mundi, which is a thinkable history. One could have to take that seriously. I'm not prepared to put it on the level of this is the thinking now occurring for which comparison is verboten. That is to say, I have left outside of the thinking about that history lots of stuff which I think is pertinent to the very history that's developed there. So I'm not so quick to take as fact that the Christian story about how we've gotten here. That would take a lot more thinking. And at the point in which it said the thinking now occurring is not comparable, but it's fact evident, if that's supposed to include a new interdiction upon my ability to think that history through, I'm suspicious of it.
Right.
Okay.
But I did say that it doesn't involve
It doesn't involve that. All right. But then the introduction of the idea that when we say the matter is the transparency of existence to thought or thought to existence, the issue is not the name that's put on it, Jesus Christ.
Right.
And then you say, well, he's Thomas Edison. I'm not so quick to say he's Thomas Edison because that's the issue that seems to be outside of the area that I'm not supposed not to think about.
Well,
I wish I could slow down. Is anybody following me?
I'm not sure where you come out, because if Thomas Edison, assume for the sake of argument that Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, right? Okay. And you know nothing about that. It doesn't, the fact that you are ignorant of the fact that the guy who invented the first
Yeah,
instrument
that's
that
right.
you're...
And maybe Jesus Christ is doing the whole thing. And maybe so. But I don't know that, even though...
Well, I mean, but the point is that somebody did it.
I don't know that.
Somebody invented the light bulb? Or you want to say no?
Well, I could have a lot of constructions about that history in which the actual invention of the light bulb was a mere technician working out somebody else's ideas. It was complicated.
Right.
There are a whole lot
Okay.
of different
Right.
things could be involved in the light bulb.
Was there a first light bulb or no?
It may be irrelevant to this question.
Well, I mean,
No,
who
but I'm
brought
not
this
saying-
up? You.
No, but
No, it isn't that Jesus Christ is like Thomas Edison, but rather the light is like the light bulb here. That's
Well, that's good. I like that.
yeah.
right. But it's like
So it doesn't matter.
It's
who-
not
I can say, I can. Most of the things that seem to be apt and really fetching and really keep me going in the concrete picture of the thinking now occurring, I can relate to other histories that have different transcendental essences. Mu, Dharmakaya, Tao, Brahm, all of these different things patch into the actual
Well, are you saying that in these other traditions you can find the equivalent history as, let's say, the history of modern thought? You can find a
of
Kant
course
and a
not.
Hegel
No, of course not. But that's the
and a
part.
Husserl.
But that's the part which seemed to me to involve a lot more of historical analysis than is present in Novitas Mundi in order to say that gets us to the thinking now occurring.
But it did.
Well, not that gets us to us in this book,
Yeah.
but the conditions that you're responding to, you say are discontinuous with that. The actual
Well,
leap.
I'm open.
Yeah.
Look, let's put it this
Yeah.
way. I'm open to other histories. If you have one, lay it on me. But in the
Okay,
meantime,
yeah. Yeah, all right,
I have a history here.
Yeah.
Okay, and in this history on page 345, which we're going to have to backtrack next time, but let's jump ahead for the last couple of minutes since we're on this issue. Here's a good example. I've already really, in effect, mentioned this. At the bottom of 344, the knowledge of the Eucharistic essence of existence itself had by thought among those everywhere in whom existence has affected the sight of itself. This is the consciousness of the other in essence as being the absolutely incomparable gentle friend. You could say that's a reference to Jesus Christ, who shares himself essentially with others in the form of man. Now that makes it pretty clear. This is the knowledge of the fact itself of existence. In the celebration of the infinite Passover, the appearance of the Eucharist qua appearance is now seen for the first time in history to be itself the Eucharist in essence, to transcend appearance, to be appearance itself. No longer are the elements on the table seen to be other than what they are in essence, namely the flesh and blood of God in the form of man. Right? Now, that's very specific. Okay? So, I think it's a good place to try and deal with this issue. Now, so what I'm saying here, and as the page goes on, is that if I say that what I'm saying, well, let me read a little further, and then I'll come back. In the celebration, no longer are the, I really said it. What I'm saying there, in effect, if I abstract a little bit, is that appearance, to oversimplify it, equals substance. I mean, that's the meaning, that's the intellectual, right? So in the Mass, traditionally, it's understood that, of course, the appearance bread and wine it's a different substance there, right? It gets a little technical between Luther and Thomas. One substance, one substance, okay? Two substances, one makes it. The basic, they are in agreement that here's the appearance behind which is a substance that does not appear. The appearance is different than the substance. So I'm saying they're identical. All right, now, Adam, many meetings ago, when we were making the difference between appearance and reality, raised the question, well, what about Plato, right? But in Plato, while there was a real difference between appearance and reality, there was no possibility of identifying knowing with the world of appearance. It was quite the contrary. It was the whole point, right? And even in Aristotle, who is more worldly, as it were, than Plato, the act of knowledge transcends the rational animality of the knower. You see? Yeah. Okay. So how do we account You tell me. So I'm open. Wait a minute. Well, it's a rhetorical question.
Okay, all right, I'll shut up.
I don't want to silence you. I just want to make the point.
Yeah.
So how do we account for being able to think this now? How do we account for it? And while it's not the same thing, accounting for it or explaining it is not the same thing as actually thinking it. Okay. Nevertheless, to the extent to which we're going to explain it, right, and we're going to locate it, so to speak, in world history, we have a very, very intelligible account of the movement from the Eucharistic, unprecedented separation of the notion of substance and appearance, which leads then to, in Kant, just to skip, make it quick, to identifying knowledge with the phenomenal world and the bracketing of the noumenal world, right? So there's a dichotomy. I mean, I would be very interested in the sense in which Kant intends it. If we can find in other civilizations this move, I don't know. Maybe it is, and I'm open to hearing about it. But in the meantime, not having heard about it, I say, well, that's really extraordinary. I mean, how did that happen? And I think I have a clue as to how that happened. And then I notice that when Kant and Hegel are digested by Peirce says, not out of ignorance, but in other words, with specific but qualified reference to both of those guys, he says, well, yes, there is a difference between the appearance and the substance, but it's not an absolute difference. In other words, he denies what he could only deny if both the separation of Kant and the peculiarly absolute identification of Hegel, if those two moves hadn't been made, Peirce wouldn't have existed as Peirce. His intellectual perception would be unintelligible, because it's only in that context that it makes any sense for him to say, well, there's something of the substance in the appearance, and in other words, there's no, behind every appearance is, or in every appearance, you know what I'm saying? Or because he denies, it's that vagueness, it's that blending, that he can add nothing and being, and it's intelligible. It's not just a waste of time, you see? So that indefiniteness, which James grabs upon, right? The indefiniteness, the vagueness in the reality of things, which comes out in quantum mechanics. All right. So what is being said here? See, now I talk about Peirce and American thought as a kind of approximation of the thinking now occurring, as a kind of non-anticipatory. Didn't anticipate this, you know what I'm saying? It wasn't like Heidegger in that respect. I wasn't anticipating anything, but nevertheless, de facto, we can say it somewhat anticipates what? Okay, now we're going to be able to identify appearance and substance in a way that is only intelligible in the context of this very specific history. Now, I grant you that this book does not exhaust the whole of Western. It doesn't attempt to. It tries to be an essential history of Western thought, right? And so you could bring other things into the discussion. But to the extent to which this is an essential history of Western thought, then the thinking now occurring and the role of Christianity and the faith of Christianity and the object of the faith of Christianity, I think, is not only not removable, not a matter of indifference, but in a certain sense, it is critical to understanding where we're at now. Even if I stop penultimately, even if I stop with Peirce, I can't understand Peirce if I don't understand this history, I think, but having to be taken seriously. Yeah.
This has given me a different perspective, though, on religiously. And just to clarify that, I'm Roman Catholic, liberal politically, but pretty traditional in terms of theology or dogma.
Sound like the Pope.
No, I have many disagreements with the Pope on many levels, and we won't get into that.
Okay.
But thinking now occurring makes me look backwards to historical Christianity and to what I've learned through the years, and makes me see it in a different perspective, and makes me in some ways see the historical incidents of Christianity as a metaphor in some way, not to mean that historically I don't accept them, but I also see them as metaphor for a larger truth. And in that sense, it's backwards in a way, but if you can take where you've gotten to in thinking now occurring, it seems to me that you can work backward to that, from that point to other points, just as I don't think that the redemption by Jesus Christ of mankind, which I believe in as a matter of really, I don't think is limited to Christians. And I don't think it's that Christians mean more to the Creator than other people. I think this happened as an historical fact. But just as I believe redemption spreads beyond the construct of Christianity, it seems to me